Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents This is BS by Michael Anderle, narrated by Derek Shoales. Chapter 1. A part of her relished the chance to get back to work again. For Vickie, it meant things were returning to normal, and it surprised her a little how appealing that thought was. She certainly didn't mind participating in the adventures Taylor, Bobby, and Tanya found themselves in. And the other part of her that had tasted the excitement wasn't entirely sold on the idea of normal. Still, at that moment, she hoped everyone would get back so they could do what she thought of as real work. Aside from all this, the distractions were killer for her grades. While she could certainly apply herself and get those up, it inevitably meant more work, the kind she didn't appreciate since she had a full-time job. With things returning to their usual routine again, there was less stress. The downside, of course, was that everything was boring and she would soon ache for something more exciting to do. She was aware of the apparently contradictory demands that always seemed to be in conflict within her, but it wasn't necessarily a problem. She'd made an early start after an uncommonly good night's rest. Traffic hadn't yet reached a peak, with most of the people still struggling to get up after a weekend of partying on the Strip. Of course, there was any number of those who started early, but by this time, they were already at work. She pulled up to the strip mall and turned the security system off as she pulled her Tesla in to make sure Taylor knew she had arrived. By her estimation, there wouldn't be much for her to do for the day. A couple of new suits were due in for repairs, but that had always been Taylor and Bobby's realm in the shop, and Tanya now learned the ropes and picked up tasks from them. Vickie wasn't entirely sure how it was happening. Maybe spending all the extra time with the mechanic paid off in more ways than one, but the woman learned the details of working on the suits faster than any of them had anticipated. She was still behind Taylor and Bobby, of course, but she was catching up quickly. It wouldn't be long before they didn't need their boss to be on the work floor, and they would have to find something else for him to do. Or maybe it simply meant they could take on more work than before. Taylor seemed like the type who wouldn't simply rest on his laurels when his business did well. Hard economic times were always around the corner, it seemed, and they wouldn't wait around for things to go badly when there were other possibilities. He was already up and in the shop when she pulled in. He didn't look like he had been doing any work, though. His attention was focused on his laptop, which rested on the desk, and she could see very little sign of the usual grease stains that covered his hands when he started work early.
"Hey, Taylor,"
she called from the car as she closed the door and made her way to him.
"What are you doing up this early? I thought you would sleep in today."
The man narrowed his eyes at her as she approached. "Why did you think that?"
"I don't know. You own the place, so there's no reason for you to be up this early. That's what you pay us to do, right?"
Vickie watched him carefully and expected some kind of witty retort. It was one of the things she liked about him, although certainly not the only thing. He had a sharp mind for conversation, and it was fun to keep him on his toes. But something was different today. His eyes seemed vacant and unfocused, the vagueness emphasized by the way his gaze flicked constantly toward the screen of his laptop, even though there wasn't anything open in the display. He realized that she had asked him something and snapped his head around, trying to recall what it was. Yeah, I guess. I wasn't able to sleep much last night, so it was a matter of sitting around upstairs or down here. I flipped a coin and came down here." She sat in the seat beside him, powered her work computer up, and studied him closely.
"Is everything okay with you? You seem much less obtrusive than usual."
Taylor scowled at her. "And what's that supposed to mean?"
"Well, if you want me to tell you that I don't look forward to a little banter in the mornings when I come in here, it would be an outright lie. You're usually a little more alert and talkative, so the fact that you're not means something might be wrong, or off, or whatever terminology you'd prefer to use to describe the fact that you're simply not yourself."
He stared at her for a few seconds, and she realized he was at a loss as to what to say next. Maybe he was trying to think of a response. Then again, maybe he wasn't sure what was happening himself, and he was distracted by looking for the answer to that. Either way, Taylor without a quick retort wasn't very common, which made it interesting enough in its own right. He was saved from having to think of a decent response, though, when the shop door began to open again and Bobby's truck drew in. He and Tanya had carpooled often lately, and Vickie wasn't sure if the woman spent that much time at his apartment, if they had moved in together, or if she had moved into a place of her own. Taylor had offered her accommodation in the strip mall, and while not the best, it was better than not having a roof over her head at all. It was also better than many different apartment complexes she had seen around Vegas, but not by much. The high internet speed was what put it head and shoulders above the competition, but Tanya didn't seem like the kind of person who would fully appreciate having full-speed internet. The vehicle stopped and the couple slid out, clearly eager to get to work. Bobby brought his traditional offering of donuts and coffee, enough for 4.
You know, you should think about paying Bobby for these deliveries he makes, Vickie noted.
She pulled up the scheduling software she had started working on once it became clear that she would work more from the desk than on the suits that were being delivered.
The dude brings food and coffee every day, so you might as well make it worth his while, right?
Taylor snapped out of being lost in thought again and focused his gaze on her. Oh, yeah, that's probably a good idea. He's brought me the receipts for the purchases, though, and I've added it to his salary every month already. That's what you meant, right?
Wow, you really are out of it today. What the hell is going on in that red-crowned head of yours, Tay-Tay?
His scowl over the nickname was what she most wanted to see, and it was enough to lift her spirits a little more. For his part, he ignored her question and made his way to the improvised break room where Bobby and Tanya began to get ready for the day. Vickie wasn't about to let him off that easily, and followed him quickly to the other side of the shop to snag her coffee and one of the chocolate-sprinkled donuts. Is the delivery still coming in today? Bobby asked, blissfully unaware of his boss's current mood. She intended to change that, but there was time to fit business talk in, too.
The truck's scheduled to arrive in a couple of hours. It should give us enough time to get the shop cleaned and ready before they get here, but it'll also mean enough time in the day to get the suits set up and put work into them before we close for the day. What do you think, Taylor?
The man took a bite from one of the vanilla-glazed confectionaries before he realized she had spoken to him. Oh, yeah, that would be great. We do need to get some of the tools and parts squared away and make this place ready for action again. Simply because we've been out of the country doesn't give us an excuse to leave our workplace looking like a pigsty. Bobby had known Taylor longer than she had, and she could tell that the stout mechanic was now a little suspicious. It wasn't glaringly obvious since Tanya didn't react in the same manner, but something was going on with Taylor, and Vickie was determined to get to the bottom of it. What kind of priorities will we set? Bobby asked, most likely in an attempt to glean more information about what was plaguing his boss. She doubted they would get more than a typical response from the man. The fact that he continued to glance at the laptop every few seconds meant there was something there he wanted to get back to, and he didn't want them to see it. The hacker convinced herself this was a mystery that needed her to solve it. If necessary, that was what she would do all day today. While there was work to be done, this was one hell of a lot more important. She would peek into her boss's personal life, intrude, and make a general nuisance of herself. For his own good, of course.
Tay-Tay,
Vickie grumbled as she started to walk to the desk and the laptop he watched like a mama hawk.
Do you really think we won't notice that something's going on with you? Seriously?
Tanya looked surprised, but it disappeared quickly. Bobby's expression remained unchanged, and he shook his head gently as he took another sip of his coffee. Taylor looked at her with a hint of defensiveness in his posture. It was probably the first time she'd seen him like this, and it was a little disconcerting. In private. Come on. She followed him quickly up the stairs to his living quarters. He dropped into a seat and gestured for her to do the same. I think I'm going crazy.
What? You only realize this now? You're fucking nuts, Taylor. This isn't news. Can we get back to work now?
His scowl was deeper than usual, and she stopped herself from saying anything else. Crazier than usual, I mean. His voice was a little calmer, but far from relaxed. He sounded more intense the lower his tone became. I chatted to your cousin over dinner the other night when we got back from the zoo, and I think she was hitting on me. Vickie stared blankly at him and needed a moment to process that.
You're right. You're crazier than usual.
Right? Taylor agreed and extended a hand to her. Right? I thought that was a little too far out there, too. She said something like, I would have to take her somewhere nicer than Ilfornio on our first date, and I couldn't tell if she was joking or not. She shook her head. Hitting on Taylor didn't sound like the Niki she knew. Of course, joking about him taking her out on a date wasn't like her either. Nothing about this made sense. The only rational deduction was that she was probably missing something, a part of the story that wasn't there. I mean, Taylor continued, she knows me and isn't the kind of woman to go for the kind of guy I am, right? The hacker dragged her hand through her hair and tilted her head curiously.
Do you want her to have meant something by it more than a throwaway joke?
He finally looked into her eyes, and she didn't like the feeling she got from him. It had a desperate feel to it, and coming from a man who usually didn't appear to give a shit about what was happening around him, it felt uncomfortable to see him so vulnerable. I don't know. She and I work together well enough, and I wouldn't want to mess with that. Vickie nodded. She had her answer, even if he wasn't willing to admit it to himself.
Well, now that you got that off your chest, do you think you can put your head into the shop and work without us having to worry about you losing a hand while operating the machinery?
Taylor smirked, and that was the most like himself he had appeared all day. "Yeah, I think so. Let's get to work." Elisa couldn't quite believe that she had reached this particular point. People fantasized about quitting their jobs and made a big deal out of it, a statement of some kind. They were usually those who hated their lives while trapped in a cubicle doing meaningless work. Many dreamed about the day when they would have the leverage to leave. Well, she didn't think she had the leverage. There wasn't any choice for her at this point. After the shit she'd seen, merely being a reporter in the middle of it was not appealing. The secretary looked up from her desk when the intercom buzzed and waved to grab her attention where she sat and waited as patiently as she could.
"Cass will see you now,"
she said with a small, polite smile. Karen had worked at the Crypto Inquirer almost as long as Elisa had, and knew more about the ins and outs of the company than Cass probably did. The man was the creative type, but he never admitted to knowing much about running a business like this, even though he had been to business school. He was content to let others more inclined and qualified manage what they could on his behalf. She stepped inside the office and detected the faint hit of cigarette smoke that told her he was probably about 10 minutes away from lighting another one of those cancer cylinders. It also meant she had almost the same length of time to talk to him while he was in a good mood. "Morning, Elisa," Cass called and gestured for her to take a seat across from him. "I hope you're not feeling too jet-lagged, since I do want to know what you found out during your time in Vegas. Learning the truth about who committed that robbery would put our little operation on the map, and it's about time people noticed us." Elisa fought back the feeling that made her want to help him. Of course he hadn't been responsible for any of the hardships she had gone through, and she didn't intend to hold anyone at the Crypto Inquirer to blame. Her time with them was at an end, however, and there was no good way to break it to him.
"Cass, I'm here to tender my resignation."
Well, that was much simpler than she thought it would be. There was no way better than simple and direct, she decided. He laughed, probably thinking she would say she was joking or retract her statement. After a few seconds, he realized she was completely serious. He leaned forward on his desk and stared intently at her. "Is there a reason why you've suddenly decided to leave us? Is it money? Did someone offer you more money? Is that why you're ducking out on us? Because I can tell you right now I can give you a raise. It probably won't match whatever you've been promised, but you have to know the loyalty we've shown you over the years you've been with us." Elisa knew he would go on for a while about that, and she had no desire to listen to his speech about loyalty. She had heard it 15 times by now, and she had the entire discourse down by heart. Instead, she raised her hand and brought his speech to a halt.
"It's not about the money, Cass. These things were much more fun to write about when—"
She couldn't tell him about what she had seen during her adventures, so all she could do was shake her head and hope that was sufficient to add weight to her words. "What? What is it?"
"Well, I did discover things when I was in the middle of it, but while I was there, the people who got me out of the trouble I landed in made me sign an NDA that would keep me from legally sharing virtually anything I discovered while I was in Vegas."
Cass looked confused. There was some disappointment involved as he sensed there was a story hidden in what she tried to hide. Even so, she wouldn't try to convince him otherwise. If he wanted to go out there and deal with the Vegas mob, that was his call to make. "Well, shit. Is there anything about what happened you could share?" Elisa considered his question for a moment.
"Well, I can tell you that I wasn't in Vegas the whole time, which, yeah, you don't need to worry about the cost of the trip. I won't submit the receipts for reimbursement. The only cost relevant to you is for the flight over there, of course, since you guys bought that for me before I had a chance to do it myself."
He nodded. "That's fair, I guess. I really hate to see you go, El." She stood from her seat and placed her letter of resignation on his desk.
"Yeah, me too."
With her usual efficiency, she'd emailed him a copy as well to make sure it wasn't lost in the pile of paperwork. Given the way he looked anxiously at the bottom drawer of his desk, she had a feeling he would have a smoke before returning to work. The chances were something would be lost before the paperwork could get to HR. With nothing left to be said, she stepped out of the office, closed the door behind her, and headed toward the elevators. Once the metal doors closed and she could feel the car moving down, she released a long sigh.
"That went about as well as I could have hoped,"
she muttered to no one in particular. Chapter 2. It was unquestionably an exceptionally pleasant morning. Niki Banks wasn't the kind of woman to enjoy things like that. People who had the time to smell the roses were those who tended to look around and enjoy the view of the sun coming up in the sky on a cloudless day. The busy people never had the time to notice or talk about how it was evidence of one deity or another painting a picture. Even then, Nevada didn't have much in the way of picturesque landscapes to enjoy, unless one happened to like a shit ton of desert with a view of mountains in the distance. Jansen and Maxwell stood nearby and pored over a selection of files while she spent time on the other side of the hangar. While she didn't have the time for the grand vista, she did enjoy the cooler temperatures that came with early morning near Vegas. She moved to where the two were busy and nursed a warm cup of coffee as she inspected their work. "Did you know," she said to break the silence that hung over them, "that the state of Nevada is the fourth largest producer of gold in the world?" Maxwell looked up from his work and removed a pair of reading glasses. "No shit." "Yeah, I read that somewhere. Nevada, if it were its own country, would be the fourth largest gold producer in the world behind China, Australia, and Russia. Apparently, it also has the world's second largest gold deposit behind some unpronounceable place in South Africa. And people kind of stepped right over it on their way to California during the gold rush. How the hell did that many people miss that much gold when that was all they were looking for?" Jansen didn't even look up from reading through the files to answer her. "The gold around here is low grade, mixed in, and hard to find. They didn't realize there was any around here until 1962, as I recall. It takes a very technical process to leach it from the rest of the bullshit." Niki scowled and took another sip of her coffee. "Still, though, I can't imagine San Francisco would be that big of a place if people had stopped here instead of there." "Nevada would probably not be the same place either," he pointed out. "Do you have some ideas about where we'll head next?" She placed her cup on the table. "I thought you guys had more of a connection with Spear than I did." "We report to Mr. Spear about what you do when you're out and about and wandering the earth, looking for monsters to kill. It's a one-way street, though. He doesn't tell us anything about what we're supposed to do. That's all on you." "Well, since it's all on me, I guess we do have a couple of inklings of people doing the wrong thing with shit they pulled out of the zoo. But we're still in the process of building a team, so inklings won't cut it until we have a proper, bona fide emergency on our hands." "In that case..." "Yeah, we call in Taylor McFadden. Until then, can you at least tell me we have a hacker on our list who can help us?" Maxwell frowned. "I thought you'd arranged for your old AI to be transferred." Niki sighed. "Spear has signed off on it, and the FBI have told us they don't want it and prefer to use their own. Dumb choice, and they're shooting themselves in the foot by sticking with their inferior software. But it's their call. The problem is that until the creator has run a full integrity scan on the software to make sure it's not corrupted, DoD won't authorize the upload. We can't sit around with our fingers up our asses until they reach consensus, so we need a hacker." Jansen pushed a couple of the files to her. "We have a couple of candidates, but it's tough to validate them. People don't exactly put hacker on their resumes. We can look into software engineers and the like, but they probably won't have the skill set we need. More importantly, it's unlikely that they'll be willing to do what we need them to do. We've looked into people who might have criminal records that they've concealed and that kind of thing. Sometimes they don't even need to have them concealed as long as we can find out what they did." "So we're simply picking cyber criminals up off the street?" She raised an eyebrow in disapproval. "Of course not. There are extensive procedures we've followed to find the people who might be prime candidates for your team. That's why there are only 2 files. She scowled as she looked at the manila folders in front of her. The entire process irritated her because she knew she already had the people she wanted on the team. The very, very best and people she could trust. Vickie and Jenny were both the best available. Except, of course, for the small problem that both were currently employed by the private sector in jobs they probably infinitely preferred to working for the DoD. Her sister had established herself as quite the juggernaut in her company, and Vickie was going through the motions of college while she worked with Taylor in his business. While she could probably make more money with the DoD, Niki doubted the girl would want to be involved with working for the government. She was too much of a free spirit. Besides, working with Taylor had been a positive influence in her life, and she didn't want to remove her from it. "Thanks." She looked up from the files and realized that Jansen was speaking to her. "What?" "Your phone's ringing." So it was. She took the device from her pocket and checked the number to make sure it was who she thought it was before she pressed the button to answer the call. "Good morning, Mr. Spear. I assume it's still morning where you are?"
"That's a reasonable assumption. I'm pleased to see you're already at work. As it happens, I have work for you. Our intelligence has been rigorously focused on their efforts to gather substantial intel on a particular company. This information is, of course, concerned with the unofficial and below-the-radar operations of a company that has worked with assets imported from the zoo. It is interesting to know that there are a limited number of people who have access to what has been taken from that fucking jungle, and that so many of them fail miserably in their processes to contain it."
If Taylor is to be believed, that shit is as alive as the monsters he ends up having to kill. It's like it's alive and trying to get loose.
It doesn't help that the contracts are passed through on political affiliations rather than actual competence.
Yeah, I can see how that would make things a little more complicated than they need to be.
Either way, we do have a couple of people in place to investigate the work of a firm that goes by the name of Gottfried and Gottfried, a family-owned business.
How does a family-owned business get a government contract?
I should mention that the Gottfried family has worked in the realm of pharmaceuticals since the time when people got cocaine in their cough syrup.
Oh.
Yeah, but moving on, the people we have looking into their projects have discovered very real signs that hinky shit is in progress. They'll dig a little deeper, but we need you to go in and be enough of a pain to draw the CEO in, which should provide an opportunity for you to investigate whether these people have fucked up enough on their contract to warrant your intervention. So, what do you think? Are you up for it?
Niki thought the man was merely yanking her chain, but there was something to be said for professionalism in the workplace, even if it happened to be a hangar out in the middle of Nevada. Of course. That's what you hired me for, right?
Spear laughed over the line. Of course it is. I'm really glad you still feel like it's a job you can do. I'll send you the details. Or, rather, I'll send the details to your team.
The call ended abruptly. He was never one for goodbyes, it seemed, and Niki no longer expected him to be polite over the phone. Maybe that was simply the way he was. Either way, it had little relevance to the matter at hand. Niki turned her attention to Maxwell and Jansen, who had stopped their perusal of the files that had been provided and stared expectantly at her. They had done so ever since she picked the phone up. Well, it looks like we have something to do after all, she said, and grinned as she stated the obvious. Jansen, you should receive the details via email in a couple of minutes. Once that's done, you can probably go ahead and file a flight plan, since I have a feeling that whenever things get bad to the point where we have to be involved, it means they are about to spiral out of control and take the term shit hitting the fan to a whole new level. The two men immediately began to clear the paperwork from the table. They could continue working on it while on the plane.
Will do, boss,
the smaller of the two assured her as Niki scowled at the now lukewarm mug of coffee in her hand. If they had to constantly jump whenever Spear had something on the docket for them, she would need a more complete team than merely whoever was still alive from her time with the FBI. Until then, though, putting out fires and jumping from one emergency to the other necessitated improvised solutions, and this was the best she could do for the moment. After a few years of focused work, things had finally begun to look up. The pressure that resulted when people were put in charge with the expectation of rapid results would always end badly. Richard Albert Torrance had been put in a position where immediate success was the only option available to him. While he could return to teaching at Harvard, that had always been intended as a part-time gig. Tenured professors were never those at the forefront of biological discoveries. This was especially the case when there were all kinds of new fronts to explore, and an alien force made the advances for them. All they needed to do was discover them and document them for future use. Two options were available to him if he wanted to be at the cutting edge of this opportunity. The first was that he could go to the middle of the desert and study everything up close, which didn't feel like an option at all in his mind. Or he needed to work at one of the labs that picked up the biological material sent out of the jungle for testing and study. The latter seemed like the better choice and would still ensure that he would be ahead of the pack and put his name on some of the discoveries that came from the zoo. It was what had led him to be recruited by Gottfried and Gottfried, and it didn't take him long to realize that many other people had come to the same conclusion he had. Too many other people, he thought with a grimace. Aside from the basic irritation of such a long drive to reach the lab, it also provided too much time to consider a situation he often thought of as impossible. He had purchased a small house in the suburbs, and even though there was very little traffic on the road to the isolated facility, it still took almost 3 hours to get there and back. Of course, being research director did have a few perks. He had his own office with a small room and a cot where he could spend the night if he wasn't willing to drive all the way home when he had worked a particularly long shift. That mitigated some of the negatives, but it still wasn't ideal. Although, he reminded himself, it was better than heading out to the middle of the nightmare jungle. Barely, but still better. He pulled up to the front entrance and waited for one of the guards to approach and check his identification. The higher-ups had sent warnings about corporate espionage and had become more and more paranoid about security. This had already reached the point where they put all the resources possible into securing the hell out of the building. Surprisingly, it included having all the security guards meeting every single member of staff so they didn't rely only on electronic systems that could be broken into and hacked. There were still problems with their decision to focus on only low-tech security. On top of the guards being able to recognize everyone, an additional system of ID cards with tracking chips in them made sure that not only were they tagged coming in, but every step they took through the facility was tracked. This second layer was because there was a problem with human error, too. Terrence had read somewhere that most people who were called hackers by the media were mostly grifters who knew how to talk themselves through the high-tech security systems that had been put in place. The practical result of the precautionary measures was that they extended the 3-hour drive from his home by a 15-minute wait while people checked and double-checked whether he was allowed to enter the building or not. Finally, one of the smaller doors on the perimeter opened, and an older guard ambled toward his Lincoln. Terrence already knew to lower the window as he approached.
"Good morning, Dr. Terrence,"
the man said with a small smile as Terrence passed him his ID card.
"I hope you had a nice weekend."
Not too bad, not too bad. Brock, right?" He smiled.
"Yep, that's me. These security checks are more and more invasive by the day. Do you think I'll have to ready myself for cavity searches before this whole paranoia comes to a head?"
Brock laughed and handed him his ID card.
"Hell, I hope not. No offense to the very skilled and intelligent people who work here, but between you and me, I'd rather not see what they have going on under their lab coats. But nah, these are merely a few more precautions. The CEO was alerted that we had a couple of visitors from the DoD, and he wanted to make sure everything was secure just in case. He talked about contracts being reliant on the added security or something like that."
Terrence kept his pleasant smile in place, but alarm bells rang in the back of his head. DoD visitors? At the lab? Why hadn't he been alerted about this? He was the research director and had run the entire lab for the past 3 years, and provided the CEOs with all the results they had demanded. Many people had vied for the job when it was thrown out there, and the board had wanted assurances from those who took over the facility that it would give them a leg up on the competition. He'd promised them that and more. They tended to believe whatever a Harvard professor told them was possible, and didn't question whether what he intended to do was legal or not. For the most part, of course, it was legal. It was also the kind of thing that was frowned upon in the community of supercilious pricks he had dealt with most of his life. A significant number of papers had been written on the dangers of testing the goop that was pulled out of the jungle on biological subjects, much less live ones. This meant most of the people in Washington would get nervous if someone from the DoD told them about what was happening in the lab. But what was the point of having all the security if they couldn't take risks to stay ahead? Of course, the CEO would claim all kinds of ignorance over what was happening, fire him, prosecute him, and then turn and hire someone else to do the same thing. He grasped his wheel a little tighter as the gate began to move. Terrence didn't wait for it to be fully open before he eased his car through and drove it into the underground parking lot. Too many people forgot where they were supposed to park, but no one would pull into the spot that was the closest to the elevators. That was the one with his name on it, and he halted so abruptly that his tires squealed slightly. Many people might have tried, but they would be the ones who were fired. There were literally thousands of biology masters and PhD students who would have killed for a job in his lab, and that fact alone was enough to keep the others in line. He stepped out and into the elevator, pressed the closed door button, and scowled as it took him to the second floor. Having a corner office wasn't quite as great when it didn't overlook a city with a great view, but it was still a corner office. He wouldn't complain about it. And there was a view, of course. Looking out into nature was still a pleasant way to achieve zen while he drank his morning coffee and prepared for the day ahead. It was a good start to be able to sit for a moment and appreciate the view. But not today. There were more important matters to attend to.
"Get Jerry on the phone,"
Terrence told his secretary before she even had a chance to get a word in edgewise. Niceties would have to come later.
"On a secured line."
Of course, Dr. Terrence.
He stepped into his office, closed the door, and made sure to lock it before he moved to his desk where his landline was already ringing. He picked it up off the cradle and waited for the line to secure itself before it connected with his second-in-command's phone number.
"This is Dr. Greer." "Jay, it's Rich. Look, were you here when those DoD guys came over? The guard at the front says they came, but it wasn't when I checked out on Friday, so I assume it was over the weekend. You were in charge then, right?"
Hey, Rich. Yeah, there were a couple of guys from the DoD. They said they were checking for contract violations regarding the security stipulated. They weren't around for long, though, and only talked to the guards, checked their stations, and made sure our electronic security was on point. They didn't come down to the lower levels.
"They didn't see what we were doing down there, right?"
Of course not.
Greer didn't sound too concerned, and Terrence certainly respected the man's judgment.
Most of the servers there are isolated anyway, so they didn't even see a hint of what takes place. Believe me, I had the computer people run checks on all the systems they looked at, and it was only about the security. There's nothing to worry about, I promise.
"Okay, thanks, Jerry. I'll be down shortly."
Despite his friend's assurances, he didn't feel completely reassured. People sniffing around his place of business meant that either it was simply a routine audit or someone was suspicious. While logic said the former, a deep unease suggested the latter, and that it was only a matter of time before they needed to do some cleaning. He needed to get a cleanup procedure on paper, just in case.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?